Well, evening everyone, and glad we're back again for this evening. Just a reminder that we're not here next week. It's a break, the fourth Tuesday of the month, and then on the 2nd of November we're back, and the 9th of November two more sessions, and we complete the particular thematic socio-political reading of Luke's Gospel. This evening, it's Gender, Justice and Luke with a question mark, and I hope we will see why after a short time we've put a question mark after the title. We've been in the informality of conversation, been talking, I think, about travel briefly, not having to travel to sessions like these, but travel has been curtailed for many during the pandemic and even before COVID. Domestic air travel in Germany had already reduced by 12%, and travel by train hugely increased. This seems to be because of a growing environmental consciousness in Germany. Perhaps Germans are more green aware than we are. But even if our travel has been restricted and we are traveling more locally, we still need a suitcase. In our travels, we pull or we push our suitcases on wheels. Now, did you ever wonder why it took 5,000 years after the invention of the wheel to put wheels on suitcases? It was only, it seems, in 1972 that the first rolling suitcase was patented. Katrine Markel, a Guardian journalist, came across a photograph of a woman in a fur coat pulling a suitcase on wheels from 1952, 20 years before the invention. And Markel began some historical investigation and found quickly that the modern suitcase was born at the end of the 19th century when mass tourism was taking off. At Europe's railway stations, there were large numbers of porters to help you with your baggage. By the mid-20th century, porters were a dying breed as people were carrying their own bags. In the 1940s, someone invented a wheel device that could be strapped to a suitcase, but it wasn't popular. And in 1967, a Leicestershire woman complained publicly that a bus conductor forced her to buy a ticket for her rolling suitcase, arguing that, quote, anything on wheels should be classed as a pushchair. So there it is, a woman in a fur coat and a woman from Leicestershire suggested that suitcases with wheels were for women, and the market was not ready for wheeled suitcases. There was indeed resistance to the idea. Men carried luggage for their wives and partners. And so Markel concludes resistance to the rolling suitcase had everything to do with gender. Rolling suitcases did not align with our views, it seems, on masculinity. And then in the 1980s, more women were traveling alone without a man to carry the luggage, and a suitcase on wheels became a dream of greater mobility for women. And this is not the only innovation that has been gendered. An electric car first appeared in the 1800s, and it was seen as feminine because it was slower and less dangerous. The world opted for petrol cars, and even when electric starters were invented, they were considered as something for women. For Markel, gender answers the riddle of why it took 5,000 years for us to put wheels on suitcases. We still have male-dominated industry, she says, not interested in dealing with the fact that women influence 80% of all consumer decisions. The financial system stubbornly refuses to see the potential of women's ideas. And today, less than 1% of the United Kingdom venture capital goes to all female teams. And the few women who do get funding are majority white. Markel's point is that the economy is built for men. West Germany began to move away from dependency on coal in the 1970s, but it will be 2038 before Germany is rid of coal. Germany still has 3 heavily industrialized areas where lignite mining occurs. And those mines would go bust in a decade if they were not in receipt of heavy state subsidies. The mines are kept going to save jobs in areas where work is hard to come by. It has been described as keeping real jobs for real men. But when a well-known chain of German pharmacies closed, putting 10,000, mainly women, out of work, there was barely a murmur from politicians or media. It does seem that the economy is gendered, and even in innovation, many products are built and designed with men in view. Now, what has all this to do with Luke and women? Luke has a lot to say about economics and wealth and poverty. We've been exploring that. We can't imagine Luke's Mary singing her song of praise and pulling a suitcase on wheels from Bethlehem to Nazareth, or wealthy businesswoman Lydia in the Acts wheeling a suitcase on her business travels. But Luke has more women in the Gospel and Acts than Mark, Matthew, and John. But does Luke do gender justice? The number of women in Luke is surprising. He picks up on the women in Mark, one of his primary sources. He also picks up on the women in the Q source, the document of the teachings of Jesus. And Luke has many other women only found in his, what we call his special L material, the material exclusive to Luke himself. He often pairs women and men, especially when dealing with the teaching of Jesus, such as the man who plants the mustard seed and the woman with leaven in Luke 13, 18 to 21. Then there is the man who searches for the lost sheep and the woman who searches for the lost coin in Luke 15, 4 to 10. This is from Special L. Only Luke has these stories. There are two lists of names of Jesus' followers, one list male in Luke 6, 12 to 19, the other women in Luke 8, 1 to 3. Luke refers to widows more often than the other Gospels, suggesting that Luke is acutely aware of their economic helplessness and exposure in a male-dominated society. The later church may have placed a strong emphasis on Mary as Virgin Mother and defined her by biological motherhood, but not Luke. Mary is rather blessed for her belief, and whilst there is a tension in the gospel between her passive obedience and radical revolutionary song, she is among those later in the gospel who, quote, hear the word of God and obey it. Luke is not conveying to his community of faith a passive obedience, but an active obedience better described as a life praxis, a social praxis. And especially in the pairing stories, Luke does seem to be encouraging women and men to identify with the characters as models of faith and social practice in their world of empire. Now, read in this light, Luke's gospel, with its surprising number of women, does seem to treat women positively and enhance their status. Women dominate his birth stories. Mary is presented as having a key role in God's liberating purposes. She serves God, as does Jesus. There is also Elizabeth, who with Mary and Anna recognize God's liberating activity in their lives and respond with praise and active following of God's ways in the world. Mary's song of praise portrays her in the prophetic tradition, announcing God's liberating activity for the powerless and the oppressed. It is personal and societal liberation from the systemic injustices of the Roman Empire. Anna waits patiently and faithfully for the birth of Jesus, and though no song or statement is quoted or referenced, she, quote, speaks about the child to all. Anna is paired with Simeon, who does have a short song, again a hymn sung by Luke's faith community, acclaiming a disclosure of salvation, social and economic liberation for all people. Women and men in Luke are agents of freedom and hope in the world of empire, active participants in the reign of God in the life of the world. In Luke 10, 1-12, Jesus sends out 70 to heal and announce the inbreaking reign of God. Now, healing of sickness and mental illness is significant in the Roman world, in which imperial oppression and violence are the root causes of sickness, physical and mental. And Luke's healing stories and the sending out to carry on this activity of Jesus is symbolic of a counterculture, an alternative empire to that of Rome. Now, there's nothing explicit about women among the 70. They may have been among the 70, but this is an argument from silence. In Luke's gospel, it is women, not men, who are loyal to Jesus through the darkest days of crucifixion, burial, and on Easter morning. The men have fled, but the women are still there. And without being told, they take the initiative to proclaim the resurrection gospel to the rest of the unbelieving male apostles. Subsequently, as companions of the 11, they hear the testimony of the 2 who had encountered the risen Jesus on the road to Emmaus. Jesus appears to them, and they, along with the men, are commissioned to a mission of proclamation to all nations in the power of the Spirit. Now, some later artwork depicts one of the 2 people on the road to Emmaus as a woman, appearing. But Luke and Luke's text is silent on that. At the end of his gospel, written to a community of faith trying to be faithful to the empire of God in their Roman world, Luke has women as the first to proclaim the liberating power of resurrection, hearing the story of the 2 on the way to Emmaus. And the women with men are sent to all nations as agents of justice and peace, to sing Mary's revolutionary song of justice and the song of the angels, or the army of peace. And in the Acts, we see all of this in action, with perhaps more women in Acts than the gospel, involved and active for the reign of God in the life of the world. So far, so positive for the role of women in the faith community. But we need to read more carefully and more critically Luke's writings. There's still a question mark after gender justice in Luke. There is ambiguity in Luke, and Luke may not have been liberated from a patriarchal world. For all Luke's positivity about women, the world of Luke and the church of Luke may still be a world and a church designed for men. Well, let's stop there, and Loretto can allocate us to rooms and maybe ask ourselves a question. We'll live with the ambiguities and Luke for the moment, but what positives do we take from the role of women in Luke's gospel? We will take about 20 minutes on that, and then we'll come back and have an open conversation. Okay, have we returned, I think, after roughly 12 minutes maybe. But let's look at Luke and gender ambiguity. Now, as pervasive as sectarianism in our society is patriarchy, the two, I suppose, are inseparable, though patriarchy is probably older and may even be the original sin. Patriarchy has been described by 2 authors, Carol Gilligan and Naomi Snyder, as a culture based on gender binary and hierarchy, which results in the division of human qualities and capacities as either masculine or feminine, with the masculine privileged or superior, and the elevation of some men over all men, and all men over women. Now, we've already noted earlier that the economy is often built for men, and this can be true of much else. Patriarchy as a system is all pervasive, though the privileging of the masculine elevates some men over all men and all men over all women. Now, a further description of patriarchy is offered by my colleague, Dr. Cathy Higgins, in her book, when she says, today, patriarchy as a form of fraternalism continues to validate male privilege and power in both household and state. It perpetuates a relational model based on domination and subordination, and it has created and sustained inequalities to protect those with power within the geopolitical and socio-economic systems, usually the male elite. So both women and men suffer or are oppressed by patriarchy, it being a system of power exercised by a male elite. Now, Luke wrote the Gospel and Acts in a patriarchal world, as did Mark, Matthew, John, Paul, and all the other Christian Testament writers. We've already encountered the huge inequalities of that world and the imperial systems that embodied patriarchy as arrangements of power built around male elites. There is no surprise that patriarchy is in the atmosphere of all the Christian Testament writings, and it is the air breathed in the world of the Hebrew Bible, the classical Greek philosophers, and all of the classical religions, ethical and philosophical ways of life that were birthed between 900 and 200 BCE. Nothing, it seems, escapes patriarchy. Luke does not manage to avoid it, and he's no full-blooded champion of gender justice, even though justice pervades his gospel, from Mary's song of revolutionary praise to a liberating God, to his resurrection stories, and continues throughout. If after all that Luke is patriarchal, or at least ambiguous, we cannot say that he was willfully so. That would be, I suppose, to apply a different ethical standard to Luke than we would apply to ourselves. And of course, we are not patriarchal. But then, because we don't think we are, does not mean that we're not. We are usually unconsciously. We may be unconsciously patriarchal. That's how pervasive the system is. Now, we may need to be critical of Luke while not condemning him. In being critical, we may learn to recognize our own patriarchy and ambiguity and experience some liberation and transformation. Now, women do have a greater role in Luke than the other Gospels. We have recognized that, and we have affirmed that in the Gospel. He was saying something significant about women and men to the faith community for which he wrote. But there are negative factors in Luke, and at the very least, Luke is ambiguous. Patriarchal cultural roles are still there. Luke may have 42 passages in his gospel about women. That's many more than other gospel writers. And 23 of those passages are special L, texts unique to Luke. But then Luke has 133 men in his gospel and only 10 women. And these men speak hundreds of times, while the women only speak 15 times. And on 5 of those times, their words are not given. Jesus is portrayed speaking to men hundreds of times, but only 15 times does he speak directly to women. Jesus speaks to Mary, the sister of Martha, who listens to Jesus without ever commenting or asking a question. Luke does not have a woman challenge Jesus or take the initiative in going beyond the boundaries of Judaism, for example, to the Gentiles. Now, Luke had Mark before him when he wrote his gospel, and he used a lot of Mark in his own theological way, but he left out the Markan story of a feisty Syrophoenician woman from Mark 7, verses 24 to 30. And in Mark, this feisty and persistent woman gets Jesus to change his mind and to cross borders to Greek-speaking regions. The woman pushed Jesus to broaden his mind and his vision and change direction with his liberating program of the reign of God. Luke leaves that story out. And Luke has no counterpoint story of the dialogue of equals between a Samaritan woman and Jesus in John 4. Furthermore, the Mary and Martha we meet in John's Gospel have more powerful roles than they do in Luke. Luke's women are generally much more silent. Mary and Martha are silent in Luke, and both are much more vocal in John. Why Luke's silence? And why Luke's ambiguity? Again, in Luke, the ratio is 14-1 in favor of men. It's been put this way, that by numbers, the gospel is relentlessly androcentric, with women marginalized and silenced. There are some other negative factors to note. Luke has call stories involving male disciples, but no call stories involving women. The inner group of Jesus' friends are male with no women. Luke has a story of disciples leaving wives, but no story of wives leaving husbands. Does this suggest that male gender is the norm for following Jesus? Women accompany Jesus, but are not called disciples. Men are given power in Luke to exorcise, preach, and heal, but not women. And remember, the gospel is written to a faith community as a program of action, a model of who they are and what they are for in the world. So what is the messaging? Women are in the group sent out in the power of God to share a liberating vision with all nations. But Luke 24:33 has male disciples and women followers. Why are they referred to as their companions? There is hardly a discipleship of equals here. In Luke, women are nurturers, but never named as disciples or apostles. That may be significant. Luke, it's been said, thinks of women's proper attitude as a listener, pondering what is not understood, learning in silence. The women in the gospel, as in Acts, can be called a hearing community. In Luke, we have positives and negatives. Luke is ambiguous, and we recognize that. Women have roles, significant roles, but there is no discipleship of equals. Women are not equal participants, as in the Jesus movement, and that is the message conveyed to the Lucan community of faith around 80 to 90 CE, when the gospel was written. And how did that impact the Lucan faith community? 40 years earlier, it may well have been different. There are 7 authentic letters of Paul in the Christian Testament, and they were written 35 years before Luke's gospel. Now, Paul has been described as the appalling apostle, severely criticized as a misogynist, a hater of women, and supporter of slavery. But this is why identifying 7 authentic Pauline letters is significant. They were all written in the 50s, and in order. They are 1 Thessalonians, Galatians, 1 Corinthians, Philemon, Philippians, 2 Corinthians, and lastly, Romans. These letters are considered definitely Paul. With others, Colossians and Ephesians, probably not Paul, but a Pauline school. And 2 Thessalonians, 1 and 2 Timothy, and Titus considered definitely not Paul. Now, when all of these letters and gospels were written, makes a difference as to how we read them. Getting a chronology right puts them in context. And then we can begin to see how thinking and practice changed over the decades. and it did change. Paul affirms women who worked with him on an equal basis. They were Judea and Syntyche and Philippi. Romans 16 has a remarkable list of people who work as equals with Paul, and that list includes women. Phoebe, at the beginning of Romans 16, is the only person given a letter of recommendation from Paul and given 3 substantive titles. Now, male translators, and males have translated the Bible, have played down the Pauline titles. But Phoebe is no deaconess, but in the meaning of the Greek word, an official teacher and missionary in the church of Cenchrea. The title Paul gives to Phoebe is prostatic in Greek, which is not, in male translation, helper, but has the connotation of a leading officer, president, governor, or superintendent. Paul even says that she was the prostatic of many, and even Paul himself. So patriarchal translators and interpreters have found that impossible to accept. Romans 16 also names Andronicus and Junia, who were missionary partners with Paul, working together in Antioch and ended up in prison together. Paul even stresses that they were outstanding members of the circle of apostles. Junia, as an apostle and an outstanding one according to Paul, well, that was too much in the 4th, 5th century for a pope and others who changed the name to Junius, a male name, as they thought. And that translation persisted in translations of the Bible for centuries, but has been relatively recently changed back to Junia, since we now know there never ever was a Greek male name, Junius. And hopefully the restoration of Junia is a little victory over patriarchal translation and patriarchal theological scholarship. In the second letter Paul wrote, Galatians, Paul articulated a most radical view of human community in which there is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female, for all are one in Christ. Now, in the context, Paul is expressing a theology of baptism, not necessarily originating with him, but already existing in the first decades of the Jesus movement. And again, patriarchy has tried to confine these words to some kind of spiritual relationship and play down or ignore any social and political implications and praxis. Galatians 5, verse 28, in the words of Elizabeth Schuster Fiorenza, not only advocates the abolition of religious cultural divisions and of the domination and exploitation wrought by institutional slavery, but also domination based on sexual divisions. It repeats with different categories and words that within the Christian community, no structures of dominance can be tolerated. This is baptismal theology in Galatians, the lived praxis of the first generation Christian community. And though it was not possible to abolish the economic foundation of the Roman economy, slavery, or the patriarchal system, the faith community embodied a radically different culture and model of relationships. Living together in the world as the empire of God was radically different. The discipleship of equals didn't last long. This Pauline vision was modified. There were tensions between this egalitarian vision of community and the Greco-Roman world. The faith community was a human community, which was stretched, challenged by the cultural and social tensions. How do you live with powerful social, cultural norms, which are patriarchal? There were Greco-Roman household codes, and the faith communities felt eventually that they had to reach some kind of accommodation with those powerful codes. Some even inserted more patriarchal thoughts into Paul's Corinthian letters, to the extent that reading them as literally Paul, you read someone who seriously contradicts himself. But there is Paul, and there is a scribe pretending to be Paul because he can't accept all this equality business. Then there are the letters to Colossians and Ephesians with their explicit household codes, and though they may be modifications of the Greco-Roman codes, they are an even greater modification of Paul's egalitarian vision. The discipleship of equals is modified by these later writings from 90 to 100 CE, and so in 40, 50 years, the original radical vision has changed, been modified, and in the next decade, it changes again as the definitely not Pauline letters to 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus from about 100 to 110 CE express a return to patriarchy. Women are now to be silent in the church. Phoebe has lost her job, and women are to find salvation in childbirth, an extraordinary piece of patriarchal theology. Phoebe and Junia, like Paul, are long dead by 110 CE, but there is now no place for women like Phoebe and Junia at the beginning of the 2nd century. Luke writes his gospel in the middle of this return to patriarchy. Around 80 to 90 CE, modifications and change are taking place. Perhaps Luke's ambiguity towards women in the gospel and faith community is an expression of the tensions that existed and can still exist between faith and culture. Luke is somewhere between Galatians and 1 Timothy. And in today's faith community, we are somewhere between what? Secular? Serious religious decline? Still trapped in patriarchy or ambiguity? Or caught in a culture and society where patriarchy as a system still rules, stunting the human flourishing of women and men? The common good needs gender justice. But do we still struggle with ambiguity as in Luke, or with patriarchy as in the letters to Timothy? Well, we'll stop at that point. That last question may be a question that we could throw around in the groups for 15 minutes, say. Do we struggle with ambiguity as in Luke's gospel, or patriarchy as in the letters to Timothy? Is the church, based as we know it on those Timothy letters, or Luke's ambiguity, or are we anywhere close to that early Jesus movement, greater sense of a discipleship of equals? Okay, 15 minutes.